Thank you, Emily. The constant barrage of campaign ads on TV, radio, the internet, and social media have now finally come to a halt, and most of the yard signs have been taken up. A few votes are still being counted, and elections in North Carolina won't be certified until next week. Still, we have a pretty clear picture of what our leadership at the local, state, and national levels will look like for the next 4 years. Hello, everyone. I'm Joanna Helms. I'm the Economic Development Director for the town of Apex, and I co-chair NCEDA's Legislative Committee, and I have the honor of welcoming everyone today to the webinar and to introducing our guest speaker. First, I want to thank NCEDA's annual sponsors. Emily is going to scroll their names and the logos across your screens. These companies and organizations support webinars like this one, as well as other professional development programs, and we're very grateful for the generosity. Last week's elections were not without a few surprises. Every election cycle has winners and losers, and this one was not unique. Some of us are content with the results, while others might be disappointed. Either way, it's a good time for economic developers to focus on the future and what the returns might mean for our lives and our work. One of North Carolina's leading political analysts is here to help us understand just what happened. He is Dr. David McLennan, whose lectures, published work, and media analysis span American government, campaigns, and elections, political leadership, and other topics on the minds of informed citizens. Dr. McLennan is on the faculty at Meredith College, and in 2015, he founded the Meredith Poll, the only statewide poll focused on women's issues. His research includes the impact of negative advertising on voting behavior, polling methodology, and barriers to women's electoral success. Before I turn things over to our speaker, I'd like to remind everyone that Dr. McLennan is happy to take some questions at the end. Please type your questions into the Q&A box, and we will address as many questions as we can as time allows. Dr. McLennan, thank you for joining us and welcome to NCDA. I'll now turn our virtual program over to you. Our virtual podium, I should say, over to you.
Well, Joanna, thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction. And Liz, thank you for inviting me to talk to this group today. It's my pleasure to be here. It's often the case that even though we're over a week removed from an election, people ask me to talk about what it means. And I'm always careful to preface my remarks to say that although a week and a half seems like a long time to really get your head around what election results may mean, in my field, it's usually much longer than this. So I'm going to offer some preliminary observations about what the election means, what happened in the election, and to talk about public policy implications, both in the country and North Carolina. So again, I hope you will have some good questions for me at the end. I encourage all questions. I'm coming to you as someone who is attempting to be nonpartisan. So I'm not going to take a side as to who should have won or what party has the best policies or anything like that, but simply come at you, talk to you in an objective fashion. Well, I think it's worth saying that what this election meant to me and to many Americans is we're still a very divided nation. We went into the election cycle knowing that. We're leaving the election cycle knowing that. There was certainly no landslide for Democrats or Republicans. In fact, North Carolina, as I often talk about, is a great barometer for what's going on in the country. So we had a Republican presidential candidate win the state again. And with the exception of Barack Obama in 2008, that's a pretty regular occurrence in modern political history. Yet we kept a Democratic governor. That is not unique to North Carolina this year. North Carolina has a history of supporting Democratic governors and Republican presidential candidates. We are a very divided state. And if you look at the total number of votes cast for Congress, for example, or the state legislature, or any number of other offices, you see that we are a very divided state, even though some of our election results may not indicate that. The legislature, for example, and we can talk about that if you'd like. But again, the partisan divide continues, and I think that has real implications for policy going forward. There was hopes that this election would produce a mandate one way or the other, meaning that there would be a strong tilt in the election, either Democratic or Republican, which would signal what kind of legislative agendas would be going forward, what kind of policies would be coming out of the respective federal capital or state capital of North Carolina, but we don't have that. This was what I call a status quo election. I'm not going to talk about this entire chart, but I'm going to give you a little bit of history to help you understand that typically incumbent presidents' parties do poorly. So I start back with Ike and I take it all the way through Trump in 2020. But if you look at Eisenhower, the Republican in 1952 to 1960, you see that when he was at the top of the ticket, his party didn't do so well. Republicans lost 12 Senate seats, 48 House seats, 14 governors, 483 legislative seats, etc. You can follow across this table and get to the very end where I'm talking about this year's election. So typically a Republican president at the top of the ticket would not do well for his party. But right now, it looks like Donald Trump being at the top of the ticket, although he's not going to be president as of next January 20th, his party did okay. Republicans did okay. They only lost 1 Senate seat, maybe up to 3, depending on how Georgia goes. But it looks like it's possible that Republicans can retain control of the US Senate. His party picked up House seats. There was some thought that Democrats were going to pick up even more seats in the US House of Representatives. That did not happen. 1 governor switched hands and became, Montana is now under Republican control at the governorship. In terms of state legislative seats, now this is a preliminary number because they have not all been determined. It doesn't look like the Republicans nationwide are going to lose that many state legislative seats. And in fact, they picked up 2 state chambers. So again, the point is that having a Republican at the top of the ticket tends to not help Republicans down ballot. That appears to be a kind of a mixed bag at best. Or if you're a Democrat, it was not a great election, except for the fact that you got a Democratic president starting in 2021. So this is why I call it a status quo election. It did not change things all that much. In North Carolina, we keep the same governor. The Council of State is going to be almost the same, if not exactly the same as it was in 2019 or 2020, with 6 Republicans and 3 Democrats. We, of course, have 1 undecided race at the Council of State level. In the state Senate, the Republicans lost 1 seat, and that was in Wake County. In the state House, they actually picked up some seats. It's likely they'll pick up some seats. I don't want to necessarily indicate that all races are final. The Board of County Commissioners, I have been looking over that, and there's still some not so sure. Republicans controlled more county boards of commissioners than did Democrats before the election. It looks like it's going to be the same. So again, very much a status quo election. We're still going to have a Democrat as governor and then a Republican controlled legislature. And I think that has great implications for public policy here in North Carolina. Again, no mandate comes out of this particular election for policy. In particular, I don't think the 2020 election was about policy at all. I think it was about much larger issues having to do with political partisanship and party affiliation and negative partisanship. We see in this Pew Research Center survey, there are vast differences in terms of how Republicans and Democrats entered the presidential election year feeling about how important issues were in the presidential race. The economy, Trump supporters thought that was, by a large percentage, thought that was the most important issue. Healthcare seems to be an important issue for Democrats. Supreme Court appointments, you see the list. But big differences here, which usually leads to an election based on policy. But again, if you read the election results, it's very hard to say that any one issue, even the coronavirus, which was thought to be driving this election cycle, looks like it made a huge difference in terms of all the races. I think in North Carolina, the governor's support of his health advisors in terms of determining healthcare policy in the state probably led to his reelection campaign. But if you look at the fact that Donald Trump and Thom Tillis won their respective races, and the federal government had a very different coronavirus response than did the governor of North Carolina, it's hard to make the case that coronavirus was in and of itself the issue driving this election. So my point is, without some sense of mandate coming out of this election in terms of what voters wanted in terms of policy, it leads to a very cloudy public policy future. And for those of you who are in economic development, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what the next group of federal policies are going to be that would support economic development, or what state policies are going to be that support economic development. Really, negative partisanship reigns supreme. This was an election in which Trump supporters thought the election of Joe Biden means very horrible things are going to happen to this country. The same as Democrats who thought the president's reelection would lead to horrible things happening in this country. The point about negative partisanship is that people are basing their voting decisions less on policy issues than they are on a very strong dislike of the other party and the candidate who represents the other party. So I think Democrats came out in part because they like Joe Biden, but in a large part because they really wanted to get Donald Trump out of office. And on the other side, Republicans came out in part because they wanted to keep Donald Trump in office, and in part because they wanted to prevent Democrats from being in control of anything. So this is the environment that we're in. And again, as we look toward what needs to happen in Washington, D.C. and Raleigh for public policy to happen, which is compromise, I think the options are somewhat limited. And so I think the political context for the policy discussions that will go forward are pretty bitter. And bitterness usually does not lead to a lot of compromise. Well, let me look specifically at North Carolina, since you all are all doing economic development in North Carolina. In North Carolina, we are a very divided state. That's nothing unusual. We've talked about something like the urban-rural divide for some time in North Carolina, that rural states and states that are closely, counties that are rural and those that are urban really do vote very much in very different ways. Rural counties tend to vote more Republican, urban, and those counties near urban centers vote more Democratic. But the thing is about this election cycle is that in 2016, there were 25 counties that went to Hillary Clinton and 75 counties that went to Donald Trump, even though the state was relatively close in terms of its final popular vote total. This year, Joe Biden did well in 25 urban counties, and Donald Trump did well in 75 rural counties. The difference, Joe Biden increased the vote total over Hillary Clinton by almost 500,000 votes in those same 25 counties, and Donald Trump increased his vote total in those rural counties by a little bit more than even that 500,000 vote difference. So the point is that the urban areas are getting more Democratic and the rural areas are getting more Republican. And that leads to some really significant issues in terms of the state legislature, but also just politics generally. The idea, I was in the General Assembly 3 years ago when I was talking with a Republican state senator, and I said, Senator so-and-so, what is your goal for this year? And he said, to make sure the urban areas don't get a damn thing. And I'm afraid we're seeing that kind of same attitude as we head into the next legislative session. Well, the reality is that North Carolina is still a southern state. There was some talk about North Carolina becoming more like our neighbors to the north in Virginia. Virginia is now considered to be a reliably Democratic state, but that happened pretty much in the last decade. Well, North Carolina is not moving on the same trajectory as Virginia. North Carolina is more like Texas than Virginia in terms of its politics. It's not even like Georgia. Georgia is the southern state most recently that looks like it's becoming more and more blue. North Carolina, if you look at polls like I do about people's ideological leanings, North Carolina is a center-right state. And that affects, obviously, politics and political elections, but also policy. And the one thing I have to keep reminding people is that even though Donald Trump is not going to be president in 2021, and he may or may not run again in 2024, let's just assume for the sake of discussion that he's a one-term president and does not run again, Trumpism doesn't end. These are two of the newest faces in North Carolina politics that are Trumpier than Trump. Madison Cawthorn was elected to the 11th Congressional District of North Carolina to replace Mark Meadows. That was his seat anyway. And he beat in the Republican primary a person that the establishment really wanted. And he became a sort of darling of the of President Trump's side of the Republican Party, or whether you just determine it's all of the Republican Party, but he is now kind of an up-and-comer. And then Mark Robinson, who was recently elected to the lieutenant governor position in North Carolina, again, represents a different kind of politics than we saw from Republicans a decade ago. So Trumpism doesn't go away, even though Donald Trump may not be the president. So that's something I think we need to contend with, both from a political perspective, but also a policy perspective. They're going to take different approaches in Congress and in the Council of State than even their predecessors did. All right, so what do we expect in Washington now? We're heading into a new Congress with a new president. What are the factors that are affecting policy discussions and policy debates in Congress? Well, the first thing is we're going to have divided government, but if you look at this chart, that's not new. We've had relatively few years with complete Democratic control of the House, Senate, and the White House, and relatively few number of years with complete Republican control. So we've got Democratic and Republican control in Washington. In some of these years, there was lots of compromise. If you look into, say, the latter part of the Carter administration, into the Reagan administration, even all the way through into the Clinton administration, divided government did not mean that we weren't passing laws. However, as we've gotten into this decade and look ahead into the next decade, we're in a position where compromise is a four-letter word, and we see less coming out of Congress than we did in previous decades. Well, I think one thing it's worth noting, that people have talked about Joe Biden as being a creature of the Senate. He had a long Senate career before he became President Obama's vice president, and obviously before he became president-elect. This is not the Congress that Joe Biden remembers. Look at and I've put an arrow in here to indicate where he transitioned from being US Senator to vice president. Look at all the retirements that have happened since Joe Biden last served in the Senate. he has been replaced, or the senators that have replaced these retiring senators and members of Congress are more polarized than the Congress members that Joe Biden remembers serving with. The Republicans are more conservative, the Democrats are more liberal. So this is going to be the big challenge for Joe Biden, who I think will bring a different tone to policy discussions in DC, but is not going to have a Congress that is maybe, it may not be conducive to the kind of compromise that Joe Biden is used to. Let's talk specifically about my public policy predictions. Before I want to get there, I want to talk about this, and you see this in your daily work, I'm sure. We talked about how heading into the 2020 election, how much culture wars we're going to play, with the role that culture wars were going to play in politics. You know, I teach on a college campus and I see a very woke group of college students. But it's not just college students. There are a lot of people who have become awakened to the idea that issues need to change, and that whether it be racial justice or climate or whatever it may be, that politics is going to change. And in many ways, I think what you're seeing is that the corporate world is often leading in discussions about these broader issues rather than government. So whether we're talking about the workforce, you know, as I see class after class of young college students transitioning to the workforce, they're different animals than when I started teaching almost 30 years ago. These are people who approach their jobs quite differently. Consumers are different. Consumers are demanding a lot out of their, you know, people they purchase from, they do business with. Investors are pushing corporations to make different decisions. And we have more activists now in North Carolina and across the nation demanding change and forcing change on government and politics. So again, I think as we understand policy discussions going forward, we shouldn't ignore what's going on in the broader culture. We also see that affecting everything from ad spending, how many advertisers now pull their advertising dollars from people like Laura Ingraham, but it's not just exclusive to Laura Ingraham. They advocate in state and federal governments in different ways. We see partnerships forming in ways that we've never seen before. HBCUs forming partnerships with major corporations because that's what the corporations want to support. And we see pressure being put on businesses like the current Washington football team that essentially was told to change its name and to rid itself of some of its major management because of both racial justice issues and sexual harassment issues. So we're seeing a lot change in your world that has somewhat to do with government, but not exclusively has to do with government. And we also have to look at the big picture in terms of policy. You know, the pandemic is going to drive so much of what we discuss for the next at least year. We've got economic packages being considered at the federal and state level. We've got healthcare decisions that are going to impact state and federal budgets. We've got companies still being directly affected by customers as well as employees. So we entered this pandemic season unprepared from a public health perspective. We entered this pandemic period unprotected economically. You know, the number of people that lacked emergency savings or health insurance, adequate broadband, or even paid sick leave. These are some of the things that are going to drive policy that no matter whether Democrats or Republicans get the upper hand. And then you've got social justice issues. The income disparity between blacks and whites is going to be part of the Democratic agenda. Now, whether they get much through to address that in 2021 is left to be seen. The wealth gap, the racial issues around funding and police reform is going to be there. And even prison reform is going to be an issue that has not been resolved and will continue being part of the public policy discussion. So my point is that, these issues were around before the election, they're around after the election. And even though we're talking about recounts in certain states and what Donald Trump's going to do to turn over the reins of power to Joe Biden, all these sort of things, let's not forget the major issues that are driving politics in this country, but also are going to be driving policy in this country. The other big factor I think it's worth talking about is that the center in politics is undetermined. I think on all the major issues, immigration, energy and environment, racial justice, healthcare, taxing and spending, all the big issues that affect your work in economic development, the parties have moved to the extremes, and there is great opportunity in the middle. It's not just abolish ICE or jail children along the southern border. There is room in the center to talk about immigration reform. Now, whether we can get it done, that's another question. But it's not a choice between the Green New Deal or doing nothing about the climate. There is room in the middle on the environment. So my point is that even though politics is about the extremes, particularly now when we think about Democrats as being represented by AOC or Republicans being represented by Trumpism, the reality is, like in North Carolina, the country is more in the center. And I think going forward, whoever can control the center will ultimately determine what kind of policy we end up with. Well, as Bill Clinton was told in 1992, it's the economy, stupid, as part of his presidential campaign in 1992. Everything is going to be driven by the pandemic. Whether you believe that the pandemic is going to kill up to 2 million Americans, or you believe the counts are wrong, this is not a point to talk about, what side is right. The reality is we have very polarized beliefs about the pandemic, and this is affecting our public policy. Republicans, half the Republicans believe we're overcounting the death count. Only 5% of the Democrats believe that. The support for masks is very politicized. And as Joe Biden considers a national mask mandate to try to deal with the pandemic, that's going to be very controversial. Even just who trusts Dr. Fauci? A lot. Big polarization. Well, beyond just simply those issues, we've got related issues. Childcare, the lack of childcare, particularly during the pandemic, according to the University of Chicago, has cost the economy 10% in GDP. The fact that we have not had a mask mandate for the last few months has cost up to $1 trillion in gross domestic product, according to Goldman Sachs. And what we're going to see at the state level coming forward, unless we get a bailout for state and local governments, is going to be tremendous. There are estimates that up to 5.3 million jobs will be lost in the public sector in coming years because of the pandemic. And again, that doesn't even deal with some of the other social justice issues that you see described on the bottom. The difference between how remote instruction in our K through 12 schools affects people of color versus whites is pretty dramatic. All right, that being said, lots of issues at the federal level that could be on the agenda. This is a slide that I shared with groups before Election Day because I said, these issues could be dealt with by the next Congress, And depending on who is in the presidency, it's more or less likely to be dealt with. I won't go over this whole chart with you, but I'll just say there are a lot of issues that Congress could take up. Joe Biden would like to take up extending the Affordable Care Act, protecting DACA, not just through executive action, but trying to deal with DACA through legislative action. Put more regulations back on the economy, not just doing an executive order to go back into the Paris Accords. Put more gun safety laws into effect. Pass the PRO Act, which, among many things, would raise minimum wage federally to $15 an hour. You know, all of these things could be talked about, but again, we have divided government. Republicans still are in control of the US Senate. So some of these items that I talked about prior to Election Day, although they could be on the Biden administration agenda, it's much less likely that we're going to see significant changes in some of these areas. I think what we're more likely to see is incremental change in policy. I think we will see a COVID-19 relief bill coming out soon after the first of the year. I think there's appetite, even within the Republican caucus, to do some kind of COVID-19 relief beyond what's already been done. Mitch McConnell talks about maybe just under $1 trillion, with it being very targeted. Obviously, excuse me, Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden would like to see something more aggressive. I think there is opportunity for Biden and McConnell to work together and try to deal with that. They did serve together for many years in the US Senate, and we should not discount that, although it is a different Senate than when Joe Biden was there. His personal relationship with Mitch McConnell is not the same as, say, for example, Nancy Pelosi's was with Donald Trump. So we shouldn't discount that. I think we will see an infrastructure bill. I mean, this became the running joke during the Trump administration that every week was going to be infrastructure week, where there'd be a $2 trillion plus bill coming out of Congress to repair our bridges, roadways, ports, et cetera. We may not see something grand in the $2 to $3 trillion range. We may see some more legislation come out with public-private partnerships, but I really do believe the Republicans and Democrats can work on infrastructure, and that may be the most likely thing to come out in terms of economic development. And in foreign policy, I know your interest is not particularly in foreign policy, but it has implications for your work. I think the Biden administration will rebuild some of our coalitions, both in Europe to deal with Russia and others, but also in Asia to deal with China. So I think we'll see a different foreign policy coming out of the Biden administration. And I think, to be quite honest, there are many Republicans in Congress that will be happy to see that. But let's talk about North Carolina. Here's the big driver for the North Carolina policy situation. This is a projection by the Fiscal Research Office at the legislature that we're going to be in a really tough budget situation for a while. There's no doubt that the pandemic has affected North Carolina's budget situation. Revenues are down, although not down as much as initially expected, but expenditures are up. And so this is going to be a major factor driving all policy in North Carolina, but I also suspect many of the economic development things that you want to see. Our rainy day fund, which is the money set aside to help in cases of like the pandemic or hurricanes, although it has been built up over the last decade, we're still not in the same position pre-pandemic as many other states were. You see North Carolina is about a third of the way down from the top. I'm sorry it got cut off, but we are between Rhode Island and Delaware in terms of the size of our rainy day fund, that size as compared to the budget, overall budget. We're nowhere near Wyoming, which has got an amazing rainy day fund. This rainy day fund is, again, significant because I think there will be a desire to replenish the rainy day fund, the savings account for North Carolina, because it has been spent down during the pandemic. So again, tough budget situation and rainy day fund are going to be drivers. But I am cautiously optimistic about some things that are going to help in terms of economic development in North Carolina. I do not think we'll see Medicaid expansion to the 600,000 to 700,000 North Carolinians currently in the donut hole between Medicaid and Obamacare. I do think there's going to be an effort on both the Republican leadership in the House and the Senate, Bill Berger and Tim Moore, as well as Governor Cooper, to do something related to health care. And what that something is may, as left to be determined. I think there will be a COVID-19 economic package coming out of the state of North Carolina to deal primarily with small businesses. The governor is cognizant of the fact that there are small businesses that have been impacted by his decisions to keep the economy currently in phase 3. So I think there'll be an economic package to help out those businesses. And I think one of the most important packages that will come out, although it's been talked about for years, is an expansion of broadband to rural parts of the state. You know, the shutting down of schools has further accentuated the need for broadband in places where broadband has not been available widely, and particularly when it affects student learning. So I think there's a concerted effort to look at this issue from a fresh set of eyes, with a fresh set of eyes. So I think those are where I'm most optimistic about things that may impact economic development. I think we'll see some compromise on the overall state budget. You know, that the state budget has been in a very difficult spot for the last couple of years, or the legislature will pass a budget, the governor will veto it. So, you know, hopefully there'll be some movement on getting a more permanent budget in place that is more strategic. Where I think most of the economic development will come in 2021 is the same places it's come from for in 2021. I mean, you all know these examples better than I do, but you know, there was compromise on the idea of attracting the United States Golf Association to Pinehurst for its second headquarters. That was an $18 million promise by Governor Cooper and the legislative leaders, plus some additional monies coming out of the One North Carolina Fund. That I think we'll continue to see. And then Eli Lilly was promised about $8.7 million for its pharmaceutical plants. But again, you know, we are seeing, you know, many millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars used to attract businesses and other organizations to North Carolina. You know, I still think that will be the major tool that will continue going forward, with some limitations, obviously, by some budget issues. But again, you know, even though I don't think we're going to see huge bills coming out of the legislature, Medicaid expansion or other things that come out of the operating budget, just because of the Republican Democratic split, I do think we'll still see some targeted economic development. The one thing I'm least optimistic about is, will we get better redistricting? And again, I'm not going to bore you with political science mumbo jumbo, but one of the reasons why we have the situation in the state that we have is we have the most gerrymandered set of maps in the country, even after multiple court cases. And there was some hope that even if one chamber of the North Carolina legislature flipped from Republican control to Democratic control, we would look anew at redistricting and not allow one party to simply create districts that would get right up to the edge of the courts being involved. But unfortunately, I think we're going to end up heading into the next decade with Republican control of the legislature drawing pretty gerrymandered maps and the governor having no role in that. So that's going to affect us for 10 years. And again, I'm not making a political statement about who I think ought to be in control. I'm just saying, if you get to draw the maps, you're probably going to keep me in charge. But I think one of the things I'd like to leave you with is, I think I'm seeing from a national and a state perspective, there being some significant realignment going on in the parties. We know that the Democrats are already at war with one another, with the most liberal wing of the Democratic Party attacking the remaining moderates in the party. We're seeing on the Republican side, you know, will Trumpism still be the predominant philosophy of the Republican Party, or with Donald Trump being less on the scene, will traditional Republicans, with their support of things like free markets, be coming back into power? The issue is, I think, we don't know yet. And it'll probably take a couple more election cycles to sort out what the Democratic Party and what the Republican Party look like going forward. And that will have a great impact on public policy. I've talked to you enough. And so I will go ahead and turn it back over to you and see if you have questions or comments or feedback. And I appreciate any one of those three. So I'm going to stop sharing my slide and turn it back over to Joanna.
Great. Well, Dr. McLennan, thank you so much for all that very valuable information. It was a lot to take in, but again, just very valuable. I just want to remind the attendees today that if you have a question, to please put it in the Q&A and not in the chat. So I don't see any right this moment, so I'm going to go ahead with a couple that we have for you. Okay. First, so has there been any talk at the federal level about federal workforce development reform? I know that Ivanka Trump had been tasked with it several years ago, but didn't really get much traction, didn't really go very far. Have you heard anything on that front?
I mean, you know, there have been committee hearings and things like that. I think the issue is, you know, particularly with the changeover in president, and, you know, I don't think it's as high on the policy agenda as perhaps we might hope for it to be. So, you know, I think the Biden agenda, and given that Mitch McConnell still in control of the Senate, or at least presumably in control of the Senate, you know, I think we can predict some of the issues that might take precedent over workforce development. But, you know, again, there's some, I think, some champions of it still in Congress. So we'll see how much they can push for that set of policies.
Okay, great, thank you. Dr. McLennan, if you could give us your thoughts about what the General Assembly might do to assist rural broadband. For example, they could grant additional authorities to local governments to own infrastructure. Just do you have any thoughts there about their policy or their movement on the broadband front?
Well, I think that's a good question. And again, I think if we had been talking about this pre-pandemic, we would have talked about funding coming from the state of North Carolina to support, whether it be local governments or just a broader just expansion of infrastructure into these communities. You know, I think it's probably likely with the budget situation, the first step would be granting more local control. The state has been sort of pulling back on local control over the last decade. So that may be a very interesting fight to see if they give an inch on broadband. They may be worried that they'll give up a mile on terms of some of the other issues. So I think, but I do think that the issue itself has become a more bipartisan issue because of the impact of the pandemic on student learning. So it may be an opportunity for a little bit of state money, but some local control.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What role is the Libertarian Party playing in North Carolina and nationally? If any.
Yeah, I was trying to think of very little. I mean, you know, there is a libertarian side to the Republican Party. So there are still libertarians like Rand Paul in the Senate, or libertarian leaning people. But in terms of an actual impact, the libertarians probably had less impact this year on races themselves than they did in 2016. You know, the question is for any third party is, how do you get the resources to compete either at a local or a state or a national level? It doesn't mean libertarianism is not influential. So I think that's the distinction I would draw, is that libertarianism has more influence in Congress than the actual party itself. Gotcha.
Well, in that same vein, is it possible for an unaffiliated candidate to be elected to the General Assembly?
It is possible. I mean, we see it in other states. We even have two people who are in the U.S. Senate that, I mean, Angus King is the most prominent person in the U.S. Senate from Maine who is unaffiliated, although he caucuses with the Democrats. And I think what it, again, it takes a couple things to be elected to a legislative seat. If you're not part of the party, it takes a lot of resources and a big network. As many of you probably saw this year, there were places around North Carolina where there was a lot of money spent on legislative races. If you're in the Forsyth or Alamance County areas, you saw legislative ads on television, not just presidential or Senate ads. However, if you're in Wake County, it was virtually absent of legislative television advertising. So the point I'm making is that it would take the right race, the right amount of resources, and a candidate who was already well connected in that district. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but the road forward for third-party candidates is pretty bumpy.
So a few of us were chatting just before we came live with this about a possible lame duck session for a COVID stimulus package. Could you share your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, that was a great discussion in that I'm not all that optimistic. First and foremost, because I'm not sure Donald Trump is going to sign anything in the next 60 some days. And that makes, a discussion about COVID bill coming out of a lame duck session kind of moot. The other thing is I think there's still, Nancy Pelosi is still going to play hardball with the size of the COVID bill. Mitch McConnell said he wanted to keep it under $1 trillion. Nancy Pelosi still got the same bill that's come through the House that she's pushing for, much higher than that. So I think, it's hard to negotiate. It's somewhat easier to negotiate in a lame duck term, but because they're so far apart, I think it makes it difficult to negotiate. And without Donald Trump being a more significant player, it's hard to see one coming out. So I think it's going to be left to the next Congress and the next president.
So in your opinion, do you think that the political polling profession will survive, even though it's been really far off the mark in recent years, including this 2020 election?
I have not written the epithet for the polling industry. Those stories came out on November 4th. A bulk of the stories, the polls were terribly off and that sort of thing. I have a couple of responses. Number one, we're going to end up with the polls actually being closer than they were in 2016. The polling said that Donald Trump was going to lose by up to 7 percentage points. It looks like when the final votes are counted, Joe Biden may win by as many as 6 million votes in the general vote around the country. The state of North Carolina, as we headed into Election Day, it was a 0.3 point difference in the Real Clear polling average of all the polls for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. Trump's going to win the state by about 1.5 percentage points. When you talk about a 1.8% difference between what the poll says and the actual results, that's called margin of error. And so I'm not trying to be defensive about the polling industry. Are there changes we need to implement? Of course, we did that after 2016. The challenge that we face, there are two challenges. One is determining what the electorate's going to look like. I do what's called a weighting of my sample based on what the I think the electorate will be. I was totally unprepared for the overall turnout in North Carolina and the continued strong turnout from rural areas. So I'll keep adjusting my sample. And the other thing to get at is most of the people in polling think that about 3% of people are just flat out lying to the pollsters. And in a close election, that matters a lot. So I'm not completely over polling. It's as I told my dean when she asked me what election meant for the polling industry, I said, well, we're addicted to polls. And I'm not sure we could go through an election cycle without feeding that addiction.
Right. Well, sorry about the barking dog in the background, the joys of working from home.
Oh, yes.
A couple of last minute questions as we wrap up here. Two predictions, if you will, for the future. Leading contenders, perhaps, for the North Carolina governor's race in 2024, and also leading contenders for Richard Burr's U.S. Senate seat that he is not running for re-election again in 2022. So again, governor's race 24 and Burr's seat in 2022.
Well, I think the governor's race is going to be obviously dependent on the Senate race. So I'll talk with the Senate race first. And, you know, the Senate race will be interesting because, you know, open seat elections tend to bring out large numbers of people on both parties. And so I think 2022 will be one of those races. There's no natural, I think, you know, sort of person in waiting for either party that, you know, sometimes you can kind of predict who the leading contenders are. I think it's going to bring out a lot of people on the Republican side. You know, I think there are some legislators who might look at the Senate race. There's some House members that I could see moving over to the Senate. I'm thinking about Richard Hudson, for example, could be, he's young, is a good campaigner, that sort of thing. On the Democratic side, it's a little bit challenging to see. I mean, there's some younger candidates, you know, Josh Stein is always recognized or kind of rumored to be seeking much higher office than Attorney General, whether that will be the Senate race or the governor's race 4 years from now. That's up in the air. We have I think someone down in the Charlotte area, Jeff Jackson, who is, you know, very, I think has his eyes on higher office, although he's not well known through North Carolina. You know, I think what I see on the Democratic side is that Roy Cooper is the last of the sort of Jim Hunt group of politicians. I'm not suggesting Roy Cooper is going to run for Senate. In fact, I don't want anybody to say that. But I just think it's a new generation for Democrats as well as Republicans. So it's a little hard for me to see. But the governor's race, depending on how the Senate race goes, we may have people in the Council of State looking up the ballot. I do think that Lieutenant Governor, our new Lieutenant Governor, would be a natural, assuming everything goes okay. So it's a cloudy future, but I think also an exciting future for people in North Carolina because it's kind of a new generation of politicians. So I as a good politician, I didn't answer your question.
You did perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you again, Dr. McLennan, for that valuable information and that guidance. We know your time and expertise are in great demand right now, and so we appreciate you clearing a spot on your busy calendar to be with NCEDA and its members. That was really a fascinating analysis that will give us a lot to ponder in the coming days and weeks ahead. We hope that NCEDA members and guests found this discussion to be beneficial. Our thanks again to NCEDA's annual sponsors for their year-round support of professional development programs like this one. And in this season of gratitude, we know that you'll all want to take a moment to remember the generosity of those individuals and the entities that support North Carolina's economic development community in one way or another. And that list, of course, is very long. Just so you know, there's more in the works in NCEDA's professional development webinar series. Please watch your email for additional information on a virtual networking opportunity to come up and other webinars that will be held in early December. In the meantime, stay connected, stay focused, stay healthy, and we will see you soon. Thanks, everyone.